by the shogunate, but crypto-Christian or hidden Christian communities persisted. And so there's one really interesting document that we were looking at that surfaced in the late 19th century, which dealt with how these hidden Christian communities remembered biblical stories. And there's the story of like Jesus' birth nativity, and then in tradition, right? Not really biblically, but in Christian tradition, there's a story of three wise men coming to pay their respects to Jesus. But then in this sort of hidden Christian story, these three wise men were the kings of France, Turkey, and Mexico, which is very bizarre. But I don't, for some reason somebody's remembered these countries or these regions, and so yeah, that's why we were talking about like how did they like was Turkey a named region in that period? Like who knows, right? Yeah. So okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for starting the video. I'll cut that out later. Welcome. I know some of you were here last week. Some of you are new. If you're new, welcome. I'm Yudai. I'm sure you all know me. I'm an intern here at TUC. And so today we're going to actually get into the modern period of Japanese history. We're going to talk about a very specific example again of Japanese poetry. Now, this is something that I've been working on, so it's going to be oddly specific today, but hopefully I've managed it so that it's still understandable to everybody as well. So before we sort of get into the actual text that we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about Bible translation, which I'm sure you know about this quite a bit. I'm not going to go into this deeply, but just as an overview, some of you might know this history already. So in the Meiji period, I assume that everyone's lived in Japan long enough that you know what the Meiji period is, right? Yeah, yeah. Or you're Japanese and you went to school here. So often, the Meiji period is significant because it's kind of this clear demarcated line, whether justifiably or not, the first period of Japanese modernity. And so we have a lot of Western texts coming into Japan being translated. The Bible is no exception. So this is when the Bible gets fully translated into Japanese for the first time, as far as we can tell from the evidence. And so the Meiji Bible translation becomes the official translation of the churches here. Hi, Noriko-san. Good morning. Oh no, please have a seat. Thank you for coming. Oh, and there's a handout, so please take one. Yes, the New Testament portion was translated first. It was completed in 1880. So you had the New Testament translation circulating in Japanese print culture at this time. And the Old Testament was completed in 1887, so just 7 years later. So the way that they were circulated, they're often circulated like this. They're published as individual books. So like the Gospel of Matthew was published as the Gospel of Matthew and circulated. So you had every book of the Bible. Some of the shorter ones were put together, like the prophets in the Old Testament, for example. Some of them will be put together and circulated. But there are basically these like bunsatsu, these like small, like shorter books. And then once the New Testament was completed, they had like a complete New Testament that they printed and circulated. And then same with the Old Testament. And then there was a full Protestant Bible that was circulated. Now, but even before the Bible translation was complete, Japanese Christians were starting to read the Bible in Japanese, and they were beginning to experiment with it a little bit. And so today, I want to talk to you about one of these experimental texts. The one today is called 12 Stone Monuments, or 十二の石塚 in Japanese. Okay, it's by a poet named Yuasa Hangetsu, or his real name is Yoshio, but his authorial name is Hangetsu. He's a graduate of Doshisha University, a pretty early graduate of that school. Now, what I want to tell you about is that this poem that we're going to talk about today it's probably the first Western-style epic in Japanese. Okay. Now, I'm not going to really go into like these sort of the specifics of this categorization, but when you think about Japanese poetry, right? What are some of the main Hey Claire, what are some of the main characteristics that come to mind when you think of Japanese poetry? Just like off the top of your head. Yeah, what about the beat? Or what about the rhythm? What's the rhythm of Japanese?
Lots of fives and sevens.
Yeah, that's okay. There's mainly fives, and so it's syllable based, right? All right, and Japanese poetry is basically based on divisions of 5 and 7 syllables, right? It could be 7-5, 5-7, 5-7, 5-7-7, like, or they're like longer versions of that, but it's a lot of 7s and 5s. And so that rhythm signifies poetry throughout much of Japanese history. But then when you think about like an epic poem, right? When you hear that term, like think about like Western poetry, even if you don't necessarily like reading this stuff, what do you think of? Like
Rhymes.
okay, there's rhyme. Yeah. Rhyme is often a characteristic of a lot of kinds of poetry, like not just Western poetry, but also classical Chinese poetry, right? What else comes to mind when you think about? When you think about epic, what is an epic poem? Like, what kind of poem, like titles or poets, are we talking about when we think about epic? There's one up here, but
Beowulf.
yeah, okay, Beowulf. Okay, Beowulf. Yeah. That's a good. That's a good one. That's a good one. What else? I was thinking more like classical, Greek or Latin. Like the Iliad, like Homer is kind of the originating idea of the epic, right, in Western poetry, yeah. And so one thing about epic poetry is that they're usually metered, right? And metered is not something that really translates well or easily into Japanese poetry. So there's already this question of like, if you're reading all these Western texts and you're like, oh, this is so cool. I want to make my own form of epic style poetry in Japanese. What are you going to do, right? That's kind of one question I want you to keep in mind. And so just to sort of demonstrate, right? This is the opening passage of the Iliad, okay? Maybe some of you read Greek. I just show you this because the Iliad has a very strict meter, okay? It's called dactylic hexameter. So I'm just gonna read this really quickly, because main and aye de theya pele yadeo akileos ulomenen he mur yaikaios alga etheike. Can you hear the rhythm? Yeah, tan ta ta tan ta ta tan ta ta ta, right? That's very characteristic of the Iliad. That gets replicated in Latin with like Virgil's Aeneid, right? And they're very much thinking of Homer when they're doing that. Now, we have the one that's really influential for Yuasa, our Japanese poet today, is Paradise Lost, right? So it's John Milton. Now, Milton's Paradise Lost does not rhyme, but it is still metered, right? This is sometimes like because like there are pronunciation differences and things like that, and I'm not an expert in early modern or medieval poetry. It's a little bit harder for me, but with loss of Eden till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. Sing heavenly muse that on the secret top of orb of Sinai didst inspire. Can you hear the rhythm a little bit? I messed up a little bit at the beginning, but you get the point. This is an iambic pentameter, okay, which is, you might have heard that if you've read Shakespeare before. It's sort of the same kind of meter, but it's very hard to replicate that in Japanese, okay? That's just sort of the baseline that we need to agree on here. So when you're inspired by something like this, like, what are you actually going to try to do, okay? So there's a translation problem when you think about poetry in Japanese. So yes, we talked a little bit about characteristics of Japanese poetry. We talked about 5s and 7s. And also when you talk about poetry in Japan, there are a lot of different kinds, but very, very, very broadly, it breaks down to 2 big kinds. One is waka, or Japanese poetry, and like something like haiku is more or less derivative of waka, I would say. And then there's kanshi, or Chinese poetry. So it's barely even really Japanese, but it's a long tradition, right? Educated people in Japan have been practicing Chinese poetry for centuries by this point, right? Or even like a whole millennium. So these are kind of the two big types. They're very different from each other, and the rules are also very different from each other. But that's important because whenever you think about translating something from the West, something from Europe or America into Japanese for the first time, like you have to draw from a language that already exists. So you're going to draw from something in classical Japanese, like waka, or you're going to draw from something in Chinese, which in this case is kanji. So you're going to end up with some mixture of Chinese influence, Chinese textual influence, and Japanese textual influence. Okay, so this is the cover of the first print of 12 stone monuments. Now this was printed in 1885. Okay, so it's relatively early in the history of modern Japanese poetry. This text right here, called the Yudai Chiba, this is often considered sort of the beginning of modern Japanese poetry, even though it's hard to always choose a beginning. This was a text that translated a lot of English poetry into Japanese, and in doing so, there are certain concerns that they had. Okay, like so I don't know what you would be concerned about if you were to try to render foreign poetry into your own language for the first time. But there are some very specific concerns that these people had. This is a group of professors at Tokyo Imperial University, which is Tokyo University today. And so there are a few things that I should note at the beginning. I said English poetry was translated first, but this kind of knowledge of Western poetry was very, very limited in Japan until the late 1850s, when Japan started to open up to the Western countries. And this movement to begin to modernize Japanese poetry started around the late 1870s. And then one of the particular concerns that these people had was about the length of poetry. Because when you think about Japanese poetry, how long is it usually? Like traditional forms of Japanese poetry. We think of tanka or haiku, they aren't that long usually. Yeah, they're usually not super long. There are some longer examples, especially from Buddhist-related traditions. There are longer examples of poetry, but even like Chinese poetry written in Japan tends towards the shorter side, because in China there are a lot of different kinds of poetry too. There are some very long ones, but the ones composed in Japan, like the mainstream ones, are like gogonzeku, shigonzeku. They're like relatively short, actually. Okay, so one thing that struck these people when they were encountering things like English Romantic poetry or Shakespeare was that, wow, this is long. And if it's long, there's probably more content, which is a bit of a simplification of what they were thinking. But they're really interested in... Noriko-san, do you have a comment? Oh, okay.
This is chicken billet.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Renga, right,
It's quite long.
it can go on for a long time. So if you can consider Renga a single poem, right?
Yeah.
But Renga is almost never single authorship either. Right, or structure. Right, exactly. Yeah. So yes, and even if you go back far enough, you have choka, right, from like the Manyoshu. But the longest choka, I believe, in the Manyoshu is 700 syllables long, which is long for a Japanese poem, but by Western standards, they aren't that long. So this is the kind of thing that these people are working with. These are the limitations that they're working with as they encounter this new kind of poetry, and they're inspired to try to replicate it in Japan. Okay? Yes. So I think I mentioned that this book called the Yudai Chiba, that this was based on rendering Western poetry. Now, we mentioned earlier that one of the main characteristics of Japanese poetry are the groups of 5 and 7 syllables. for the most part, they can't actually escape that. So if you actually look at some of their texts, their poetry, it's mostly rendered in a similar way. So this is a poem by Longfellow called The Psalm of Life. Some of you may have heard of it before. So you have the English on the left side here. So this is how it's rendered by the Tokyo University professors in the Shintai Shisho. そも霊魂の眠るのは死ぬと言うべきものぞかし. Right? You can sort of hear the fives and the sevens still here, right? And now it's not a very recognizable poetic, it's not a set poetic form, I would say, in the Japanese tradition, but they're trying to work with a sound that still feels like poetry. And so at this point in time, there's no such thing as free verse. There's no such thing as poem without a rhythm or without set lengths of lines. And so they're still working within the same framework of Japanese poetry. Now, if you can, this is a very rough Japanese translation. That's unfortunately not very good, I would say. But this is just to point out that they more or less follow the original, but there are some significant departures too. Partly because I think there are these rhythmic concerns that they're trying to work with as well. Yeah. It's a little bit wordier, I would say. Yeah, it's a little bit wordier. And so there's no, I think, intuitive answer as to how you make this into a Japanese poem that registers as a song or poetry into a Japanese listener, right? So you have to make choices. And can you keep it short? Can you keep it approximately the same length? That might be difficult. So do you expand it a little bit, and then do you add a little bit of wordings in order to fill that space? There are kind of different things that you have to think about when you're doing this. Now, so this is one sort of theory about how to modernize Japanese poetry. Okay? But there's an alternative theory that's going around that says, well, actually, this, even though they keep through the 5 and 7 syllables, this is actually still, this is bad Japanese poetry. There's a lot of criticism about this. They say it's just nothing. It's not anything, right? It's not poetry. It's just bad Japanese poetry. We should actually do good Japanese poetry, but change the content and the length so that it's more like a Western poem. And that's the challenge that our poet today, Yuasa Hangetsu, tries to rise to, okay? So this is the opening of our poem called 12 Stone Monuments. 若の浦の磯崎こゆる白波の知らぬ昔を松影の政子に伏して求むとも貝やなからん玉津島姫. Okay? So to our Japanese listeners here, does this strike you as like a kind of a classical Japanese poem? More or less? I don't know. Just feeling wise, does it sound Japanese? Does it anything really off for you? Not really? Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it probably doesn't sound familiar because this isn't an actual poem from like a classical period. But some of the locations might be though, right? Like Wakanoura is a location that comes up often in Japanese poetry. Tamatsu Shimahime is a goddess of poetry who is associated with Wakanoura. And so this is actually playing on tradition a little bit. And also notice that this is actually pretty clean Japanese. There's no loan words, there's no colloquialisms, there's no, there aren't any, I mean, you see a lot of the writing here has a lot of Chinese characters, but you can pronounce it all as Japanese, right, as opposed to Chinese. So this is a slightly different theory. And this is just the opening, and it continues like this. I won't necessarily read all of this out to you, but then here's where it gets a little bit different, right? So, 我が神よいざ行きてみむユダヤの国原 Okay, so Yudaya is like suddenly very different, right? It's very obviously a foreign word, right? So the setup is, so Yuasa Hangetsu's poem is a story that's based on the Bible, okay? It tells the story from a very obscure passage. Well, it's not obscure to some people, but it's a relatively unknown, poorly known passage of the Bible called Judges 3. If I told you Judges 3, can you think immediately of what that story is about? Even if you've been at church for your whole life? Right? Okay, but if I say Ehud and Eglon, does that sound familiar? Yeah, okay, yeah. It's the story of Ehud and Eglon. It's a very short story in the book of Judges. That's the base text of this story. So there's a question of like, how do you get there, right? And you get there, the way that Yuasa takes us there is he starts in kind of this Japanese poetic scene, like with all these words that are familiar to Japanese poetic tradition, and then we fly to Judah is kind of how it works here. So that's how he transports us to a different realm, right? Which I thought was kind of like an interesting, kind of a quirky narrative move.
But why did he focus on Judges 3 out of all the...
That is an excellent question, Mayumi-san. There's no clear reason why, but let's see. I want to give me 1 second. I want to judge if I want to discuss that in depth. No, I don't think I really get into it. So yes, I'll answer your question right now. Yeah, so so there's no clear reason given, okay? But it must have struck him as interesting. Now which is, I know that's not an answer, but there's a, so as I mentioned earlier, the concern of this, the Yuasa's concern with this poem is to create an epic, right? And so there's going to be, there's this certain format that he's going to follow. He wants the story to have, not only be, kind of take place in sort of this faraway land in kind of times, like in ancient times, right? Which is how, even like the Iliad is retrospective, right? It looks back on something that happened a long, long time ago in a land that's kind of far away, right? And retells that story. So that's partly what Yuasa is trying to do here, but they're also concerned about giving the poem didactic purpose. So they want to make the poem, so the preface of the poem is written by a famous Japanese evangelist named Uemura Masahisa. I mean, some of you have probably heard of his name. And he wrote the preface, and in the preface, he talks about how, he criticizes Japanese poetry. He says it just lacks, it's frivolous. It's just people having fun with words. And it should act, but a real poem, which by real poem, I think he's reading Western poetry, a real poem should teach morals and teach aikokushin, a love for country and also love for neighbor. These kind of nationalistic / Christian values. And so the Ehud and Eglon story, I'll get into a little bit of the details of it. It's basically, it's from the book of Judges. So it is a story about how one man is raised up in Israel and called by God in order to basically protect Israel or deliver Israel from the hands of other oppressive peoples. And so this, I think that maybe part of the purpose, I'm guessing, is to look at this kind of text that has like drama in it, and then to turn it into something that really speaks to, that cultivate one's sort of love, one's emotion, that heightens one's emotions in a way that it makes you think, I really want to work hard for my country, or I really want to serve the people and protect the people around me, something like that. So I don't think it had to be Judges 3. I didn't think it had to be Ehud and Eglon. but that's what he chose. And I'll show you one alteration that he makes to the story that's, I think, where it shows a little bit of his sort of storytelling strategy. Yeah. Good luck. Okay. So, all right. So in your handout, right? Does someone have the handouts? Yeah. Could I get it back? Yeah, thank you. Okay. So I have a few other passages from this poem that's written out in Japanese and in my English translation in the handout. So what I would like for you to do is to read through these a little bit. All right, take a few minutes to read through them. And I'm interested to hear what you notice. Okay? Even in the English translation. I think it's easier to notice things in Japanese, but even if English is more comfortable for you, I want you to take a look at the English and think about like if anything strikes you as interesting or odd, based either on your knowledge of the Bible and and biblical storytelling, or on something you know about maybe Japanese poetry. So take a few minutes, please.
The Japanese is very difficult now. It's not in like modern.
It's not modern yet, yeah. So what we understand as modern Japanese writing is still not developed in this period. Yeah. So what do you notice? Any comments?
Geographic, yeah, not is Gilgal near Jericho or something?
Gilgal. Gilgal and Jericho, I think, at least biblically, they are kind of close to each other. Yeah. So that I think he is actually reading the Bible. Yeah. So even though the Bible's not fully translated this period, the text that he is drawing from, like Exodus, Joshua, Judges, these are technically available in Japanese. I think it's a little hard to tell, but I believe he's consulting them because the transliterations match. Yeah, like the place names, the people's names, those all match. Yeah. Anything else? What do you think of the description of the Jordan River? It's not too strange, but has anybody been to Israel? Israel, Palestine? Mayumi-san, what is your impression of the Jordan River? I mean, is it a big river? Is it a small river?
It's not that large.
It's not that large.
No.
Yeah. It's not that large. Yeah. Did you see which area did you see it in?
I saw it from Jordan and also from
Oh,
Israel.
okay. Is that like towards the south then, or
Yeah, probably.
further north? Okay, yeah. What is it, like a clean river? Is it a fast river?
No, it was a slow.
Slow, right? Yeah.
And it wasn't
Yeah,
clean.
it was. Yeah. I think especially now. I think this depends a little bit on the location. To my understanding, I don't know. I've only seen it once. I don't really know. But like there's like, and I mean the description that Yuasa gives is the Jordan River running rapid in the willow shade, a hideout of tall reeds. The wind blows, the ripples are peaceful over its blue depths. Right, which is like it's very romantic in a way, yeah, and it's very verdant imagery, right? Which I think maybe a little bit, yeah. But as Mayumi-san mentioned, right, the river is not that fast unless it's like rained a lot recently, and it's like the rainy season there, right? So that depends a little bit, but it's plausible. It's plausible. But it makes you wonder whether, because Yuasa has definitely never seen the Jordan River, okay? He's never seen the Jordan River. Probably hasn't seen a photograph of it or anything. And so he's trying to just guess what this river is like, right? So maybe he's thinking more of rivers more familiar to him, right? Any other way, do you see any ways that he tries to construct a foreign land? Sorry, how should I put this? Yeah, how does he try to tell you that this is a little bit foreign? How does he make this look like a foreign land? It's not, I would say it's not super clear, but there's one thing that comes out that comes to mind.
Big white wall.
Yeah, like a big white wall. It's like, what is that exactly? It's not entirely clear what but like the idea of a white wall, like that is a thing, I think, to my understanding, in Japan. So, but like this, it is interesting though that it's, shiri no shirakabe, right? There's this idea of a 7 li wall, the li being a Chinese unit of measure, right? The actual measurement can be very different, especially between Japan and China. But if you look at classical Chinese texts, a 7 li wall is kind of the stereotyped length for the length of a city wall. So here, I think there's a plausible argument that he's drawing from classical Chinese imagery here. There's also palm leaves. Like, sure, there are probably palm leaves in like Japan, especially towards the south. But like, is it that familiar to Japanese poets? Probably not. Yeah, at least from what I can tell. Right. So that's maybe one way he's trying to make it look foreign a little bit. Yeah. And so look at the second passage. So what do you recognize from the Bible? For those of you who are familiar with the Bible, what do you recognize from the second passage? I mean, just to state the obvious,
Abraham, right?
Abraham, yeah. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? The patriarchs, right? So he begins this, so the story is set as Judges 3 mostly, but he tries to depict sort of the background or the backstory as well. Yeah. Anything else? Go out from the land of Egypt, right? This is also, right, famous biblical story, yeah? Right, yeah, those who don't, even this very phrase, right, those who do not know Joseph, right? That's the beginning of the book of Exodus, right? Because the whole point is Joseph became a leader, right, in Egypt, but then Pharaoh's later on forgot who he was, so they mistreated, right, his kinsmen, right, his kinspeople. Yeah, so then what's this whole idea about barbarians and their chariots and their hardened swords like lead sink into the Red Sea's waves? What is this about? Yeah, yes, there's the parting of the Red Sea, right? And it's Israel's exodus out of Egypt, right? So it goes through that story very quickly. Yeah. And so if you look at, and so the stuff after that, right? They sing the song of Moses, God's servant, hitting, yes, the drums, their sound ringing high, with the maidens just dancing the sleeves of their garment, beautifully layered, overturning, right? There's some basis for this in the biblical text, which I've kind of tried to indicate below, right? If you look at Exodus 15, this is called the Song of Moses or the Song of the Sea, right? There's this idea of Pharaoh's chariots and his army being cast into the sea. And then a little bit after that, you have a very, very brief passage that we often call the Song of Miriam, which is Moses' sister, right? She takes a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and with dancing, right? So this kind of imagery is replicated. Do you think Israelite women wore sleeves? A little hard to say, but do you think they have sode? It's a little hard to say, right? Because I don't think there's like really good archaeological evidence on clothing because it tends not to last very well. But from our best guesses though, right? People in that region in this time period probably would not have been wearing long sleeves. sleeves, right? Especially in the way that we imagine Japanese women wearing in like the Heian period or something, right? So there's a little bit of creative imagination already operating here, I think. Yeah. So one suggestion I want to make, I don't know, Noriko-san or like anybody else, when you hear the word hanakasane, does it make you think of anything? This was not familiar to me. This is not familiar to me. So I had to look. So, okay, this is my best guess right now, okay? So kasane, when I look it up, is usually associated with like classical period Japan and this sort of system of like color schemes for layered robes, layered clothing. And so I think the imagery almost seems to be like as the women dance, their sleeves are overturned, so you see different colors almost, right? Seems to be the imagery, which is very alien to, I think, the land of Israel. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting touch that he added into this text. And so from here, I'm going to point out just a few other quirks of this poem that I think are interesting, and then we'll end for questions. So this text goes on to describe how Israel entered the land of Canaan, right? That's from the book of Joshua in the Bible, right? What's a really famous scene from the book of Joshua? Just any of them. Can you think of one? What's like in Sunday school? They're like ones that you sing about, and like kids sing about, right? Like you can maybe think about Jericho, right? Yeah, the Jericho, right? The Israelites they walk around the city 7 times, right? And they blast the trumpet and the walls come down, right? So that scene is sort of replicated in this poem, but instead of so in the Bible says the priests blast their trumpets, right? That's at least one of the English translations. Now, the Hebrew word is shofar, right? And if you've been to Israel, you've probably seen a shofar. It's a ram's horn, right? But it's called a horagai in Japanese. So again, he turned to something familiar, right? Because ram's horn, like how do you make an instrument out of that? Maybe not as accessible to Yuasa, but he is familiar with using shells, right? Conch shells as a military signaling tool, right? So he calls it a horagai. And then when the Israelites enter Canaan, the men pick up their bows, right? This is very martial imagery from classical and medieval Japan, right? Because warriors, their main weapon was a bow and arrow until the guns started to enter into warfare. But in the Bible, there is some martial imagery about the bow. But it's not necessarily a stereotypical image of the warrior in the Bible, right? David and Goliath. David is probably the only really archetypal warrior of the Bible. There are a lot of warriors that come up, but he's kind of like a very significant one. Does he ever use a bow and arrow? Not that I know of, right? I mean, he kills David with a sling, right? Oh, sorry, Goliath. He kills Goliath with a sling, right? So another kind of example of cultural interpolation. And the entire story, okay, is set up as a vendetta. Okay? Now, did I give you Judges 3 here? Yeah, I gave you a little bit of Judges 3, right? Not very much of it on the back. I give you a little bit of Judges 3. Now Yuasa's story is the story of how Ehud, right, this Israelite leader, avenges his father and goes to kill the Moabite king Eglon, right? Now, the part where he goes to kill the Moabite king Eglon does happen in the Bible. But this is the passage I gave you from Judges 3:15 to 17 here is how the story of Ehud and Eglon starts, right? Now, I'm going to go ahead and tell you, you might remember from the Bible, there is no Ehud's father, okay? That is not a character that exists. Where does he get that idea from, though, based on this passage?
Son of Gera, right?
Yeah, that's his name, right? So Israelites usually, like Israelites in the Bible, are often named so and so, son of so and so, right? Right. Yeah. So this is Ehud, son of Gera, right? It's Gera was probably the name of his father. It might have been just like a larger clan name. It's a little bit hard to tell sometimes, but so Yuasa picks up on this. And says, "Oh, he has a father. Where does his father go?" Right? I don't know if that's what he actually thought. I'm just interpolating myself, right? And so he tells the story of how Ehud's father fought to defend Israel against this alien people called the Moabites, and then he dies in that battle. And so the last thing I'm going to show you is the scene of Gera's death, which I've reproduced in part for you below. Okay. Can someone read this for us? Brad, can you? Yeah. Oh, can you read this? This one's slightly longer. So,
Okay, so
so Gera's fight in the midst of battle right now, and this is what happens. Yeah.
he looks around, realizes the time has come. He takes his double-edged sword and calls upon a servant, saying to him, "Though short this may be in our house, let it be long, a keepsake. When the enemy again draws near, I shall die. Listen, quickly flee this place. At all costs, you must deliver this to my wife and my son, and you as well, and to you as well. May fortune follow you." Left and right, two enemies. He grabs under his armpits. Oh, how frightening! From the river's edge, he appears to jump, making a sound, and into the green depths he sank.
Yeah. So this is the scene of Ehud's father's death. Nowhere in the Bible, right? But this scene is like oddly specific, right? So he grabs two enemies under his armpit and then jumps with them into his own death, into the water, right? And so there's a scholar in Japan who pointed out that this sounds an awful lot like a scene from the Heike Monogatari, the Tales of the Heike, right? Where this Heike warrior called Noto at the Battle of Danura, if you're familiar with the story, right? It's one of the final battles in the Tale of the Heike. The Heike are the losing side in this scenario. And because they know they're about to lose, a lot of the warriors start to commit suicide as a way of achieving an honorable death. And the way this guy Noto dies is he grabs two men under his arms and then jumps into the water with them and drags them into the water with him. And so this is what one scholar has pointed out is maybe sort of the inspiration for this kind of death. Yeah. So this is an example where Yuasa is taking Japanese textual material that's familiar to him, something that a lot of Japanese people who are educated might know at the time, and then to try to fill in the story, part of the story. So yeah, I have some final conclusions that I want to maybe note as we end our time today. We have about 10 minutes. Any questions? Any additional questions?
No.
Sorry.
Yeah, please, Akiko-san, yeah.
I just wanted to better understand the context. So this is Meiji era.
Right, yeah.
So there's no persecutions anymore.
Right, yeah.
And this author may have been Christian, or what was his motivation?
Yeah, that's right. So Yuasa is Christian. His family. So some of you might know this better. Like Yuasa is a pretty famous name, I think, in Christian circles. I don't know their history as well, but I know this guy, and I know that his brother and some of his descendants became one of his family members is a president of ICU at some point, I think, and right, yeah, that's what I thought. So they're all related. So his family was converted to Christianity by Nijima Jo, who's the founder of Doshisha University, in Kyoto, right, which is the first really Christian institution of higher education in Japan. Yeah. So I think that's part of his motivation. Now that's not clearly stated in the published version of the poem. He originally wrote this as sort of a graduation thesis for Doshisha. So this is a senior thesis for him. But then his brother helped to publish it, and then it got circulated. So they are actually very interested in poetic reform. So there's a lot of language reform in general going on in Japan right now. There's the Genbun Ichi movement, which is, our writing should reflect the way that people speak, right? And because that's how European languages work. Not exactly, but that's what a lot of people thought. And so they're trying to reform the very diverse set of Japanese writing systems and trying to create a kind of prose that is closer to spoken language. There's also, but there are also a lot of spoken dialects throughout Japan. There needs to be a standard like dialect, right? That's shared by everybody. There's also the idea of the novel starting to appear, like shosetsu, right? And this is still very early in that stage. And similar to that, there's this idea that poetry needs to change to also reflect their new knowledge of Western poetry. So there's part of the stated motivation isn't so much about evangelism; it's actually more about poetry. The stated is to create, to try to experiment with new kinds of poetry, so that Japanese poetry can become more inspiring or something like that. There's the motivation there is pretty vague, but again, it has to do with this idea of like, poetry is didactic. It teaches moral sentiment, which is, I think, how it was taught to them by some of their missionary teachers. Like Yuasa himself, Yuasa's teacher at Dosha was taught by a missionary named L.L. James in Kumamoto. And that's who he learned. And he remembers being taught like Milton and Dante, and then the biblical David, because David is the traditional author of the Psalms, was also taught to this man as one of the great poets of the world. So this is kind of how the Bible is entering their imagination. Is not only is it foundational to their faith, it's also an important source of poetry or artistic writing. Yeah. So that's I think another motivation. Yeah.
Where was it published again?
1885.
85.
Yeah. Yeah.
In that period,
Mm.
was Bible in the English-speaking world
Mm.
is read in English or Latin? Or
English. Yeah. English. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the pronunciation he learned from Americans or the British.
Yeah. So.
Closer to the
Mm.
English pronunciation like that.
Mm-hmm.
How come it's like a Eriko?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Or, yeah, I mean that's one of the very good.
That's a good
in the Japanese.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, I think that's a good question. So as I mentioned earlier, so when a lot of Yuasa's transliterations, his rendering of Hebrew place names and people's names,
Yeah.
this matches the Meiji Motoyaku, the Meiji
Yeah,
translation.
it's based on what?
And the Meiji translation is translated from Hebrew.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah. At least, yes, yeah. I think that's the simplest explanation. Meiji translation is translated from Hebrew. So Jericho in Hebrew would be Jericho, right? And so that's where they get Eriko, I think. Yeah, yeah.
But maybe you covered this last week, but why? But Christianity came earlier.
Mhm,
Like
that's
the
right.
16th century.
That's right. That's right. Yeah,
Was
yeah,
there
yeah.
a Bible at that time?
The short answer is yes, but it's really hard to find. What I mean is that there, historically speaking, so first of all, there's a difference between Protestants and Catholics, right? And so Catholicism, although there are vernacular translations of the Bible, even in medieval Europe, this was after the Jesuits came to Japan during the Counter-Reformation period, right? So there's the Luther and there's the Reformation in Europe, but then the Catholic Church would they retaliate to this. And part of their thinking is before these essentially heretics, right? These Protestants spread their version of Christianity around. We need to send our missionaries out into the world. So this is part of the motivation behind the push to send missionaries throughout the world in that period. And so their Bibles are probably Latin. And their Bibles are probably Latin because it's after the Reformation, and part of sort of the the zeitgeist, or part of what the reformers do is to make vernacular translation more important than the Latin. And also, even before the Reformation, in the Iberian Peninsula, like Spain, Portugal, that area, it's said that it was a fairly conservative society where like vernacular translations were not looked upon as good things. So, and because a lot of the missionaries came from the Iberian Peninsula to Japan, I'm guessing that there's some of that cultural influence as well. That being said, I've done a decent amount of research about this. I cannot find a trace of a Bible in Japan. It's very difficult to find even a record of one. I think the closest we come to is after the Jesuits start to get kicked out of Japan in like the early 17th century. I do believe there's a inventory list in Macau that seems to list a Bible. That's the only sign I can find of one. And the one thing I mentioned last week is there's one fairly explicit Bible translation that's extant today from the Jesuit period. And there's a book called Santos no Gosagyo, which is a book of saints, which is common in that period. But one of the saints is Joseph from the Bible. And that Joseph story, it's a little bit shortened, there's a little bit added, but most of it follows the Bible closely. And at the very end, there's a small note that says this has been translated from an authentic text of Genesis. So, and also if you look at the earlier part of the translation, they're translating some of the genealogies, like things that you don't think will be that interesting from Genesis. So that it's not a final answer, but that's a pretty clear indication to me that they had some access to some sort of Bible. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Who are the target reader at this point? When the point was published and the motivation was not erroneous.
Right. Yeah, I think so. Part of the target audience is just general intelligentsia, because like the Shintai Shisho that I showed you in the very beginning, like it was a group of intellectuals. They weren't even poets necessarily. They're a group of intellectuals or teachers at the university. So I think part of these discussions are happening amongst like educated circles, people who are educated at in this new university system in Japan. Otherwise, it's actually hard to say. One thing I don't know is how widely this got circulated. Because people are aware of it by like the all I can think of is like the earliest references to it I can find after this date is like in the 1900s. So I don't know how well known it was before then, but it must have come to some people's attention. And there's so Yuasa-san had a waka teacher when he was at Doshisha. Who was from like a famous lineage of waka called the Keienha. And his waka teacher does publish an article where he references this poem very briefly. But that's because they have a personal connection, right? And so of course he knows about it. But yeah, it's hard to say how wide. It was a personal publication. It was like Jihishukban. And so it wasn't like from a big publishing house. It wasn't from like a commercial publisher. And so I don't know how widely it circulated initially. Yeah, that would be good to know though. Yeah. I wish I haven't really put in the. I'm not a trained historian per se, so I haven't really gone down to look for these records. But it would be interesting to look into. Yeah. We're almost out of time, I think. But last couple of minutes, any other questions? Yeah.
Interesting comment. I think I know why he chose this story, which is.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Actually, in Shiki, in the Chinese, we have a situation where a guy presents this evil emperor fish and tries to take a blade out of the fish and kill it, but he's not successful.
Oh, interesting.
Anyway, it just leads to, it's like a sad story. But in
Oh.
this case, like Ehud is actually successful, and then he's going riding by himself, right? So it's about bravery, and it's like this, and you find out successful. And he punches all the way to this evil guy like over the belly.
Oh, that's interesting.
no,
Yeah.
I think it's like and if you think of all the other Bible stories, it's actually he is super brave to go right in the middle. He's not
Yeah,
the
yeah,
he's
yeah.
going right inside the king's house.
Oh, that's a
all
good
the way
point,
around,
huh?
And he kills the guy, and he's successful, and he gets away. And so
Right.
that's like, for the Japanese spirit, that's really brave, right? Like you sacrificing, and we all know the Shiki where it wasn't successful. So
Oh, that's an interesting reference. Yeah. Oh, interesting.
It's a very
Okay.
cool story that way, I think.
Oh, that's good to know.
There's no
Yeah.
story like that in the Bible where it's like you go that deep inside enemy territory.
Right, right. Well, just as background, right? So the story of Ehud and Eglon, for those of you who aren't familiar, is that this guy Ehud, he has to kill this Moabite king because the Moabites are oppressing the Israelites, and so he basically walks right into enemy territory, pretending to give tribute, but then he comes back to assassinate the king. And he tells the king, "Oh, I have a secret to tell you. It's from God." And then the king is maybe an idiot. I'm not sure. He's like, "Oh, sure, I'll give you my audience." And then they go to a secluded secret place where there are no guards. And then he takes out a sword and stabs the
With his left hand.
with his left hand. Right. Yeah.
And then he takes it like
Right. Yeah.
under his cloak. So it's,
Right. It's like it has like thigh. Yeah.
It's a successful story.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah. That's right. No, okay. There's a reference to that kind of storytelling in the Shiki. I didn't know that. Yeah, that's so interesting. Okay. So thank you, everybody. We're out of time. If you have any other questions, though, please feel free to grab me. I know if you were here last week, this class is slightly different from advertised. I was going to talk about history books, but I decided to do this first instead. So next week we'll get to the Bible as history in Japan. Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Good job, buddy.
Yes. Thank you.